So in today's lesson, we're going to be learning about refugees. Now, refugees are a special class of migrants. Unlike most migrants who choose to leave their homes based on a variety of push and pull factors, refugees are forced to flee their homes. There are many reasons why one might end up being a refugee. For example, you might be caught in the middle of a civil war. And there are many unique challenges that refugees face when they reach their destinations. There are also many unique barriers that refugees face when they try to enter a new country. Now, in today's lesson, we'll be doing the following. We'll start off by defining who are refugees exactly. Next, we'll look at the current refugee crisis in Syria as a way to better understand the issues that refugees face. Third, we will look at the responsibilities of countries that receive refugees. Next, we will examine the process for applying to be a refugee in Canada. And finally, we'll look at an emerging category of refugees by considering climate change refugees. Now, to start off with, here is the official definition of a refugee from the Geneva Convention. It states, a refugee is someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. So these are people who are fleeing because they fear for their safety. Their well-being is threatened if they were to stay in their home country. So these are people who are not choosing to leave, they're being forced to leave. There is an imminent danger to their safety if they were to stay. And so this definition comes from something called the Geneva Convention, which is a series of treaties on the treatment of civilians, prisoners of war, and soldiers who are otherwise rendered incapable of fighting. And these treaties were signed in 1949 in response to World War II. And its goal was to try to help out people who were at risk due to war. It was aimed to try to avoid the atrocities that occurred during World War II. Remember, this is right after the most deadly conflict in human history. Millions of people lost their lives fighting the war, tens of millions of people, and millions were killed in the Holocaust and in other war crimes that were committed during World War II. So this is sort of in response to this. And at the time, there were opportunities for people to flee Europe. So for example, the Jews. There were many Jewish people who tried to leave Germany in the lead up to World War II. They kind of saw the writing on the wall and a lot of the policies that Hitler was enacting, and they tried to leave. So they wanted to go, but there weren't many opportunities to be taken in by other countries. So there's a very famous case of the ship, the St. Louis, which had thousands of Jewish refugees on it. And it was actually turned away by the countries that it tried to dock into. These were people trying to flee their countries, again, because they feared for their lives, but they were turned away by places including Canada, the US, and many others. And many of these people, they were returned back to their home countries in Eastern Europe and Germany, and many of them ended up dying during the Holocaust. So again, this idea of having refugees, the special class of migrants, who we would protect in these cases, it's a new concept. It's a way of dealing with these sorts of humanitarian crises. Any country that has signed the Geneva Convention may not force refugees back to their home country. Again, we don't want a similar situation to happen today, where there's a genocide being committed somewhere else around the world, and we're forcing people to go back to that situation. However, it's up to the host country to determine if migrants qualify as refugees that fit the official definition. So although a country might have been a signatory to the Geneva Convention, we're still trusting them to interpret the Geneva Convention and interpret the definition of a refugee. So there's still some wiggle room here. There's some interpretation. So different countries might consider different groups of people refugees and others not consider them refugees. Now, with that in mind, let's turn our attention to what's the most significant refugee crisis in the world today, the Syrian refugee crisis. Now, this is the largest refugee crisis since World War II by many estimates. Millions of people have been displaced from their homes, and they're being forced to go to new places. They cannot stay in Syria any longer. Now, before we get into the refugee crisis, let's look at a little bit of the background on why these people need to leave their homes in the first place. So this is because of the Syrian civil war, which has been ongoing since 2011. And the civil war began during the Arab Spring, which was a revolutionary wave that swept parts of the Middle East and North Africa in 2011. Now, during this time, there's many dictators in these countries, governments that have been around for decades in some cases, and there were many popular movements to try to enact democratic reforms in these countries, famously starting in Egypt. And the Egyptian government, the president actually resigned, and there were some reforms made, although there has been a coup since then. So not all of these were permanent changes. But yeah, there's popular uprisings in several countries. There's leaders who are stepping down, who are resigning. This is the time in Libya where Muammar Gaddafi, he is taken out of power forcefully. There's many new governments going up and a lot of democratic reforms taking place. And there's many people in Syria who are trying to do the same thing. Lots of protests in Syria against the president, Bashar al-Assad. However, Assad refused to resign. He instead decided to start attacking the protesters. And this led to a bloody civil war. And there were many atrocities ongoing. So again, this starts off as just protests and people, protesting the government, and then it turns violent. And there's instances of torture and executions, and Assad has been accused of using chemical weapons against these people. And this has led to a very bloody, very complicated, very long civil war. And this is not just two sides fighting against each other. There are many sides at play here. So we have the Free Syrian Army, we have the Islamic Front, we have Hezbollah, we have ISIS, we have the Syrian Army, we have the Kurds, and then we have various other groups that are all working in tandem. In some cases, these groups are aligned with each other. In other cases, they're fighting against each other. In other cases, they're indifferent to each other. There's really a lot going on here. And this is not just happening in Syria. There is some international involvement in this conflict as well. So there's been a U.S. coalition that's been involved in fighting in Syria since 2014. Now, the U.S. does not have any ground troops involved in Syria. However, they've been providing air assistance. So air bombings, air raids in support of the Syrian rebels, those fighting against the Syrian government. And this coalition includes Canada. Since 2015, however, Russia has been providing tactical support to the Assad regime. Now, there are some differences between the U.S. and the Russian involvement in this conflict. So American planes have been using mostly what we would call in military terms, quote-unquote, smart bombs. So these are GPS-guided bombs. And the purpose of them is they're being guided by GPS. They can hit their targets very accurately. And the purpose of this, again, is to try to limit collateral damage or the amount of civilians who are killed by these bombings, which is important because these targets are often in urban environments. These are cities that the fighting is taking place in, where lots of civilians live. The problem with smart bombs is that, well, for one, they don't always avoid killing civilians. Civilians do end up being killed by them. But they're very expensive too. On the other hand, Russia's air campaign is using more what we would call quote-unquote dumb bombs or indiscriminate bombings. So these are, again, very effective because these are cheaper. You can drop more bombs and you're not really caring where they're landing. Of course, the problem with this is that these are even more damaging to civilians. Far more civilians die due to these types of airstrikes. And this is all in addition to, again, the brutality of the war on all fronts. Of course, we have the brutality of ISIS, who've used tactics such as suicide bombings and kidnappings and executions in order to terrorize populations, and other groups in Syria as well using other tactics. A brutal, bloody civil war, to say the least. And it's a very complex war. Many different factions all holding territory across different stretches of Syria. This is not a one-on-one dispute by any stretch of the imagination. And so this map here is just showing, as of October 2016, the different territorial holdings in Syria. And this flow chart is showing the different spheres of influence in the conflict. So on the one side, you have the United States and its allies. So France, the UK, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. Although Turkey, its allegiances aren't quite as clear following the July 2016 coup attempt in Turkey. Canada would also be loosely aligned on this side, although at this point, Canada is not providing active air support in the conflict. But Canadians are involved in training the Kurds, Kurdish fighters fighting in the north of Syria. And so the U.S., for the most part, is supporting the Kurds and some other anti-Syrian government rebels. On the other side, we have Russia, and they support the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad. And Iran is also providing tactical support along with Russia. They would also be considered a member of this coalition. Now, we can see a lot of parallels here to in the Cold War, when we would have proxy wars. So think of like the Korean War or the Vietnam War, where the US and the Soviet Union sort of picked sides and supported them in a fight instead of directly fighting each other. There are many analysts who have said there's a very similar situation going on in Syria right now. This is essentially a proxy war between the US and Russia. And really what it is a web of entangled alliances that we have. The only real common enemy amongst these groups is ISIS. And you can imagine why, some of their tactics might not be, they might not be the best at making allies. And in the recent months, they have lost a lot of their territorial hold over Syria and Iraq. At the time that this presentation is being recorded, there's currently fighting in Mosul in Iraq, which is probably the largest city that they control at this point. And there's an offensive being planned to take al-Raqqa, which is sort of the capital of the Islamic State. But these other groups are all involved in fighting as well. Now, at this point, Russia, one thing to make clear about Russia's involvement in the Syrian civil war, their official PR position and why they got involved in the first place, there was actually a Russian plane that was shot out of the sky. And ISIS took responsibility for it, and Russia got to use this as a pretext to get involved in the Syrian conflict. And they were saying they were going to get involved and they were going to go after the terrorists. However, unlike the United States, who are also involved to try to combat ISIS, Russia is obviously supporting the Syrian regime. And Russia's position is essentially that any of these rebel forces that are not the Syrian government are also terrorists. So a group like the Kurds, for example, Russia and countries like Turkey see them as terrorists. And it kind of goes to show, in many similar situations, the word terrorist does not always have the same meaning for different groups. One group's terrorist is another group's freedom fighter. It's a very similar situation when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1980, and the U.S. provided tactical support to Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan at the time. Many of those fighters actually went on to form the Taliban and became members of Al-Qaeda, which backfired on the U.S. So again, these are very complex situations. You don't always know where these rebel groups are going to wind up. They have competing goals and competing interests. One other factor to keep in mind, in July 2016, there was a coup attempt against President Erdogan of Turkey. That coup was put down forcefully. He is still the leader of Turkey. Since then, Turkey and Russia have actually been closer in their relationship. They seem to be coordinating with each other more, which is interesting because Turkey used to be more closely aligned with the U.S. in this situation. So there's again, it's a very fluid situation with changing geopolitical goals. And it's very complicated. Again, with all these different rebel factions with different goals and different aims, there really is that question of who to support and who to trust. It's not always an easy answer. Now, the current state of the war is that the Syrian government controls less than half of Syrian territory. And this was as low as 16% of Syria's landmass as of October 2015. But that's gone up with Russia's involvement since then. The Syrian government has taken back a lot of that territory. But at no point did they lose the majority of the country's population. The capital of Syria, Damascus, for example, never fell to any other group. And it has been estimated that by February 2016, between 273,000 and 470,000 people had been killed in the conflict. And the result of all of this is a humanitarian crisis of a massive scale. So these pictures here are from the siege of Aleppo. Aleppo is a city in Syria, which has been very hard hit by this civil war. So in military terms, a siege is when you surround a city. A military group surrounds a city and tries to cut it off from the outside world. So there's no food getting in, there's no supplies getting in, and no one can get out. And the goal of this is to try to break the will of your enemy. They're trapped and they have to surrender. The result of this, though, is that, again, this is a city and there's lots of civilians that live there. So there are people living in Aleppo starving to death, or who don't have access to clean drinking water, or don't have access to basic medicine or basic sanitation. So there's lots of disease going around. It's a very difficult situation. And despite the efforts of groups like the United Nations, there have been ceasefires called in order to try to get supplies into civilians. It hasn't worked to this point. So in September 2016, there was a ceasefire called, and there were 8 organizations that were planning to bring supplies into Aleppo. Those convoys, those UN convoys, were actually attacked by Russian bombers. It's unclear why they attacked them, but again, that aid wasn't getting in, and at this point, the United Nations doesn't feel it's safe to try to send supplies in. They don't want to risk any more of their workers' lives. And so this is a humanitarian catastrophe. It's a refugee crisis that's, again, we haven't seen since World War II. Now, most of these people have sought asylum in camps in neighboring countries, such as Lebanon and Jordan. However, many other migrants are attempting to escape across the Mediterranean and to try to seek refuge in Europe. This is a very dangerous situation. So we can see here this picture on the right with dozens of people on a makeshift boat trying to get across the Mediterranean. Thousands of people have drowned trying to get across. And so this map here is showing where many of those refugees are going. So you can see Turkey has taken in over 2 million refugees, Lebanon's taken in over 1 million refugees, Jordan's taken in over 600,000 refugees. And in some cases, so for example, Jordan, this represents a significant percentage of their population. Something like 20% of their population at this point are Syrian refugees. So this is a huge impact. But they're doing their part to help with this crisis. On the other hand, states on the Arabian Peninsula, so for example, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, have not taken in any Syrian refugees. So there's been some criticism of these Gulf states in the international community for their lack of response to this crisis. And at this point, between 4 and 5 million refugees have fled Syria, in addition to 7.6 million internally displaced people, or people within Syria who have been forced to leave their homes but have not yet made their way out of Syria. And so this map here is just showing where these migrants are going elsewhere. So many refugees are trying to escape across the Mediterranean, but it's very dangerous. And a lot of them are making landfall in countries like Greece or Italy. Now, something to keep in mind here is that in the EU, there are open borders, so you can move freely from country to country. It's not like the Canada-US border where you have to show identification and they ask where you're going. Not so in the EU. So once you make landfall in one of these countries, you can attempt to make your way, through into other countries as well. Now, Greece, again, according to this map here, over 700,000 refugees have made landfall in Greece. This is a significant strain on the country. Greece is still in the midst of recovering from a severe economic crisis that started in the summer of 2015. So this is kind of compounding a lot of those issues. This is very dangerous, these refugees coming across the Mediterranean. Thousands have died trying to make the journey. Now, in some countries, the mood has been very welcoming to these refugees. So, for example, in Germany, they have accepted about 1 million Syrian refugees. And in some cases, this is an attempt at looking good. Germany doesn't have the best history when it comes to dealing with humanitarian crisis. Again, it's the country that is responsible for the Holocaust. And even though that's 70, 80 years in the past, there still is that legacy and that history. And this is a way of sort of trying to heal those wounds by welcoming these refugees in. And one way of trying to be seen as progressive, Germany is going to great lengths to try to make lives as easy as possible for these refugees. The transition as easy as possible. So, for example, they've offered opportunities for family reunification. So families are kept together. They're being given generous welfare benefits to try to let these people get on their feet, being given access to job opportunities. So there has been a warm welcome from many Germans. You can see there's a picture in the top right corner there of the German Chancellor Angela Merkel taking a selfie with a Syrian refugee. So again, the mood it's very good among some, but there has been some pushback. So on New Year's Eve of 2015, there was a mass sexual assault in Cologne, Germany, as well as in a few other cities. Groups of men going around groping women. And this was blamed on migrants. It was blamed on people from North Africa and the Middle East. And some of these people who were caught and identified were actually asylum seekers, but not all of them. However, that didn't stop the pushback from coming in full force. And there were many anti-immigrant groups that came out against refugees as a result of this. And a lot of this we can see in other countries in Europe as well. So, for example, Hungary has taken the exact opposite approach. They want to take in as few refugees as possible. So they've actually built fences on the border to prevent people from coming in. And this is a sentiment that we see across Europe. It's one of the factors that helped lead to Brexit in the UK, leaving the European Union. These sort of anti-immigrant sentiments were one of the reasons why what the pro-Brexiters used as in their rhetoric to get people on board, and why Britain is now planning to leave the EU. Because again, in the EU we have open borders, so we can see these sort of migration routes where refugees are able to travel freely throughout the continent. And previously, this was seen as a good thing in Europe, but now there's a lot of popular opposition to open borders. And there's there's a lot up in the air as to whether or not these open borders are going to stay long term. Now, here in Canada, we have been fairly welcoming to Syrian refugees. So during the 2015 federal election, Justin Trudeau and the Liberals pledged to resettle 25,000 Syrian refugees if elected. And when they won the majority government in October 2015, they began the process of accepting refugees and screening them, with the first arriving to Canada 2 months later in December. Now, as of October 2016, Canada had accepted over 33,000 Syrian refugees. But this is not without issues. For example, access to housing is difficult in many cases. A lot of these refugees are coming to big cities like Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal, where housing is already very expensive. And there's been issues finding these people long-term permanent housing. When they first come over from Syria, they might be put up in a hotel for a certain amount of time, but they need to find a permanent place to stay. And there's been many issues with this in terms of expense. Also in terms of landlords letting these refugees stay there. There's been many reports of landlords refusing to give interviews to refugees and not renting their units to them. So there have been many barriers to entry even in Canada. Even if we have brought these refugees over, the situation is definitely not perfect. And there's more that we could do to resettle these people. Now, what are the responsibilities of a country that's receiving refugees? Well, according to the Geneva Convention, all countries must recognize and issue travel documents to refugees. They must give them passports and visas. They must recognize and protect the unity of refugee families and respect that minors without guardians be especially protected, especially girls. Now, this is one thing that's been particularly controversial in Canada. One of the issues with bringing in Syrian refugees, there's been a pushback in terms of people's fears over security and terrorism. So the Canadian government has actually avoided bringing in middle-aged single men. They've been looking more for families. But if you're a single man, there have been very few of those who have been allowed to come over. Receiving countries are obliged to provide welfare to refugees. Again here, this isn't very well defined though. What welfare is considered in one country might be different than another. The expectation is that it's sort of comparable to what a citizen of that country would receive. High-level employees who become refugees receive special protection on account of their position. So again, if you worked in a position of government or in a political opposition and you're being persecuted in a country and you come over and you still fear for your life even in the new country, you might get some special protections to help keep you safe. And you're also expected to apply the Geneva Convention without discrimination of race, religion, or country of origin. Receiving countries are also obliged to provide all rights of accepting country to refugees that they would give to migrants. So you can't distinguish between refugees and migrants. All the same rights that a migrant would get, someone immigrating to your country, you have to give to refugees. You need to provide free access to courts of law, because again, it's a very legal process. You need to give them that free access. You need to provide the same treatment as your citizens with respect to elementary education. In Canada, we also provide secondary education, but you are not obliged to provide that. You need to provide identity papers for any refugee in their territory who does not have valid travel documents as well. So if they've lost their travel documents, or they were destroyed, or they left them in their home country, you can't use that as grounds for sending them back. You have to provide them with new identity papers. Now, this is from the Geneva Convention. It states, the contracting states shall not impose penalties on account of their illegal entry or presence on refugees who, coming directly from a territory where their life or freedom was threatened, in the sense of Article 1, enter or are present in their territory without authorization, provided they present themselves without delay to the authorities and show good cause for their illegal entry or presence. So the purpose of this clause here is stating that even if a refugee is not coming into your country, quote unquote, legally, you can't use that as grounds for deporting them. So again, those immigrants coming across the Mediterranean on rafts, that's not a legal way to enter those countries, but you can't use that as grounds to deport them. But again, there are loopholes in this. It's worded vaguely on purpose. So what does this word, the phrase without delay mean? Does that mean the second you wash up on shore, you have to immediately run and seek out the authorities? Do you get a day's grace period? Do you get a week? It's not really clear here. And in many cases, these countries could use this sort of language to try to say, a refugee, they didn't do enough to try to present themselves, and that's why we want to deport them. Now, how do you make a refugee claim in Canada? So to claim refugee protection, you must first notify a border services or immigration officer. You'll then be required to fill out several CIC forms available on their website. You'll be required to fill out a basis of claim form, so explaining why you're claiming to be a refugee. You should review the information found in the national document package which pertains to your claim. If your claim is referred to the RPD, you'll be required to attend a hearing to explain your circumstances and tell your story. You must always inform yourself of and respect your obligations in regards to the IRB. The RPD member will decide whether or not you should be granted protected person status in Canada. You have a right to be represented by counsel in your proceeding before the RPD at your own expense. Now again, if you remember, you're supposed to have open and free access to the courts. Here we're saying you have to pay for a lawyer. So you don't have to pay to have a court date, that's free. But if you want someone to represent you, you have to pay. Now, again, there are lawyers who will work pro bono or work for free, but again, an experienced, seasoned lawyer is going to cost you a lot of money. Now, your claim is not eligible if the following conditions aren't met. So if you've been recognized as a convention refugee by another country to which you can return, the claim is not eligible. So again, the thought behind this here is that if there's another country that you can go to and you are already considered a refugee there, we can send you back there. We're not sending you back to the country where, you fear for your life. We're sending you to this other country. So you can't have refugee status in multiple countries. If you've already been granted protected person status in Canada, you can't apply again. If you arrive via the Canada-US border, your claim is not eligible. So the idea behind this here is that, if you're cutting in through the US border, the question would be, why didn't you apply for refugee status in the States? That was the country you first came to. That's where you're supposed to take care of this. You can't kind of shop around and try to find the best country where you think your claim will be most likely approved. Now, if there was a situation where refugees were coming to Canada from the US, let's say there was some kind of conflict in the United States and refugees tried to come to Canada, this clause we would have to do something about this clause to change it. Your claim is not eligible if you are not admissible to Canada on security grounds or because of a criminal activity or human rights violations. So in other words, we're not going to give you refugee status if you're a war criminal or if you're a drug dealer. We're not looking for those kinds of people to come up. We're looking for people who are vulnerable. You're ineligible if you made a previous refugee claim that was found to be ineligible for referral. You're ineligible if you made a previous refugee claim that was rejected. And you're ineligible if you abandoned or withdrew a previous refugee claim. The purpose of these last few clauses is that you can't just make, hundreds of refugee claims in hopes eventually the courts are going to approve it. You kind of have one chance, and, it's based on your merit whether or not it gets approved. And so you can see here, there's many conditions attached to becoming a refugee. Not anyone can just walk into the country and say they want to be granted asylum. And it's also important to remember that this is just the start of the application process. By no means is this the end of it. There's no guarantee that your request is going to be approved. So a lot of the rhetoric about, security fears and that, terrorists are just going to waltz on in with Syrian refugees, it's not really based in fact. Yes, there are valid security concerns, and we should do what we can to screen potential refugees to make sure that they, aren't war criminals or they aren't terrorists. Sure, we should do that, but there's already a lot that's done. There's a lot that's done to screen these people. Just as an example, if you're a child being, applying for refugee status with your family, the government might go as far as to ask for report cards from your home country. They're looking for a lot of documentation. They're not just saying, okay, you want to be a refugee? Sure, come on in. Now, one emerging group of refugees that might become even more important in the future are what we would call climate change refugees. So as global temperatures are going to continue to rise throughout the 21st century, we don't know exactly how much, but it could be another 2 degrees Celsius on average. This is going to cause a lot of change in our global climate. And this might become a major issue in terms of refugees, might become a major contributor. So these are people who might be fleeing their homes not because of war, but because of drought and famine and disasters and other such calamities. Now, at the moment, this has sort of a murky legal status. Remember, the Geneva Convention is fairly narrowly defined in terms of what a refugee is. It's either you're politically being persecuted, or for religious reasons, or because there's a war going on. Right now, this wouldn't seem to fit the definition, but in the future, we might have to revisit that. It's also important to remember that as the climate changes and sea levels rise, this increases the possibility of stateless people, especially for small island nations. Think places in the South Pacific, nations such as the Maldives or Tuvalu or Fiji, where their countries might be literally underwater. in the next 50 to 100 years. Where do those people go? There might be entire groups of people, entire countries that no longer exist. So they're going to have to go somewhere, and this will complicate sort of our ideas and our notions of refugees because they won't have a home country to return to. It'll be destroyed. It'll be underwater. And so that concludes our lesson today. So in summary, refugees are a special type of immigrant that seeks asylum in another country. The Geneva Convention regulates the treatment of refugees. The Syrian civil war has produced the worst refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Countries accepting refugees have many responsibilities, including agreeing to not send refugees back to their home country. And climate change is producing a new class of refugees that will likely continue to grow in the future.